The village lay in a valley where rituals shaped the rhythm of life. Every sunrise, smoke curled above thatched roofs, and every evening fires flickered as chants and drums filled the air. To outsiders, it might have seemed a place of harmony, but within its shadows rules were bent into chains, and traditions were wielded not as guidance but as weapons. It was here that cruelty could be disguised as discipline, and punishment often bore the mask of sacred duty. The people obeyed customs without question, fearing that to resist was to offend both the living elders and the restless spirits of the ancestors. In this environment of fear and silence lived a girl, young and gentle, whose innocence was like a fragile light in a house with no windows. She longed for kindness, for a hand that would lift rather than strike, but what she received instead was harshness sharpened into cruelty. Her stepmother ruled over her with a heart that seemed made of stone. Each day she devised tasks meant not only to exhaust the body but to crush the spirit. Where other children were sent to fetch water or gather firewood, the girl was commanded to do work designed to humiliate. While others ate, she often served. While others rested, she remained bent under labor. Yet the punishments did not end at toil alone. The stepmother believed in twisting the sacred ways of the village, turning ritual into torment. Where cleansing was meant to purify, she turned it into a threat. Where offerings were meant to honor, she used them to demean. In her hands, tradition was no longer holy but became a whip of control. The villagers, though not blind to the girl's suffering, seldom intervened. Some whispered sympathy but more turned away. Fear held their tongues, for to oppose the stepmother was to invite her wrath, and no one wanted to become the next victim of her sharp tongue and harsher punishments. It was easier to let the girl bear the weight, to convince themselves that perhaps she had done something to deserve it. Yet deep within many knew she was blameless. She was merely a child caught in the cruelty of one who should have protected her. In the evenings, as the girl sat outside after completing her endless chores, she sometimes looked toward the horizon where the sun dipped behind the mountains. There, in the dying light, she imagined a freedom beyond the village walls, a place where voices were gentle and commands were fair. But dawn always returned, and with it, another day under her stepmother's rule. The girl had learned silence, for every protest was met with harsher treatment. Still, within that silence stirred something the stepmother could not see: endurance. Each impossible demand chipped away at her body but sharpened her mind, shaping her into someone who bore pain without breaking. Yet the cruelty was not finished sharpening itself. The stepmother's punishments grew bolder, stranger, as if she sought not only to break the girl's body but to crush her spirit until nothing remained. She would twist the old sayings of the village into threats and turn sacred practices into twisted tests. There came a day when her voice, sharp as a blade, carried across the compound with a command that froze the girl's heart. It was no longer enough to sweep the yard until the dust rose, nor to fetch water until her hands blistered. The stepmother's cruelty had grown hungry for fear itself. And now she had thought of something so cruel, so terrifying, that even the spirits might have trembled at the audacity. The girl's punishment was no longer just work, it was to face a ritual stained with horror. The command that followed would be the cruelest yet, a demand so impossible it would twist the rhythm of her life forever. The command came like a shadow across the courtyard, chilling the air around the girl. Her stepmother's voice, sharp and cruel, carried above the crackle of the evening fire. She was to wash her face not with water, not with the cool stream that cleansed the body, but with blood. The words hung in the air like a curse, twisting what was sacred into something monstrous. In the traditions of the village, washing was a sign of renewal, a way to honor both the living and the ancestors. But in the stepmother's mouth, it became humiliation, a tool meant to strip away the last fragments of dignity the girl still carried. The girl's heart pounded as the meaning sank in. She stared at her stepmother, hoping for even the smallest flicker of mercy, but there was none. The woman's eyes glinted with satisfaction, as if the cruelty itself was a feast. "Do it," she hissed, her tone brooking no argument. The villagers nearby exchanged uneasy glances. Even for those used to her cruelty, this command was unsettling, but fear kept them silent. No one dared speak against the woman. The girl stood frozen, her throat dry, her stomach heavy with dread. To wash her face with blood, what greater shame could there be? Horror gripped her, but refusal was impossible. Defiance would not only bring harsher punishment but also more ridicule from those who already mocked her. The stepmother had designed this command to trap her, to leave her with no escape. Either she obeyed and bore the shame, or she resisted and faced unbearable cruelty. Her body trembled, and her lips parted as if to beg for mercy, but the words died in her throat. She had long since learned that her pleas were useless. Mercy was a language her stepmother had forgotten. In that moment the girl felt smaller than ever before. The dust beneath her feet seemed to swallow her, and the villagers' silence pressed against her like a wall. She could feel their eyes upon her, some filled with pity, others with fear, and a few with cruel amusement. The stepmother's hand pointed toward the small gourd she had placed nearby, its contents hidden but heavy with menace. "Take it," the woman said, her voice like a whip. "And do as I command." Her hands shook as she stepped forward. Every movement felt like walking into a nightmare, her breath shallow, her vision blurred with tears she fought to hold back. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape this madness, but her legs carried her closer to the gourd. In her chest, her heart thundered like a drum, echoing louder with every step. She knelt, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the container, and for a moment she closed her eyes, wishing desperately for the ground to open and swallow her whole. But there was no escape. The demand had been made, and all eyes were on her. The girl lifted the gourd, its weight heavier than stone, as though it carried not just liquid but the burden of every cruel command she had ever endured. She held it close, her pulse racing, her thoughts spinning. Her stepmother smiled thinly, savoring the victory she thought was certain. The girl's horror deepened as she prepared herself to obey, though inside her soul screamed at the injustice. This was more than punishment, it was an attempt to erase her humanity. Yet even as terror filled her veins, a strange flicker stirred within her, quiet but unyielding, like a spark buried deep in ash. Something about this cruel command would not go as her stepmother intended. The night pressed in around her like a suffocating cloak as she stepped away from the courtyard, the weight of the command gnawing at her spirit. The villagers had scattered after witnessing the cruel order, none daring to help, none brave enough to intervene. Alone beneath the wide African sky, she felt the world both vast and imprisoning, her small figure swallowed by darkness and uncertainty. Each step seemed heavier than the last, her bare feet brushing against stones and roots as she wandered aimlessly, searching for a way to obey without destroying herself. The stars above glittered indifferently, their cold light mocking her turmoil. Her thoughts spun in frantic circles. How could she carry out such an order? To wash her face with blood was to surrender her dignity, to let her stepmother's cruelty mark her forever. Yet disobedience was equally dangerous. Her stepmother would find new ways to torment her, perhaps even to ruin her completely. The girl hugged herself as though her arms might shield her from the chill of fear, but nothing could silence the gnawing question: whose blood would it be? The thought made her stomach twist, for she could not bring herself to harm another, not even in desperation. She wandered toward the edge of the village, where the shadows of trees loomed tall and the rustle of leaves whispered secrets. Her ears caught every sound: the croak of frogs near the riverbank, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of unseen creatures. Fear pressed harder, but she kept moving, her eyes darting for answers that would not come. The gourd her stepmother had given her swung at her side, a reminder of the task that awaited her. She could not bring herself to open it, not yet. The weight of it seemed alive, a cruel tether binding her to her fate. Her mind searched desperately for loopholes. Perhaps she could find an animal already fallen, offer its blood without taking life. Perhaps she could trick her stepmother, smear her face with red clay or berries. Each thought came and went, crumbling under the fear of being discovered. Her stepmother's eyes were sharp, she would know if the girl tried to deceive her. The consequences of failure haunted her as vividly as the demand itself. The girl's feet led her to the river, where moonlight rippled across the water's surface. She knelt at the bank, her reflection wavering in the current. Her own eyes looked back at her, tired, hollow, yet glimmering with something unbroken. She dipped her fingers into the cool stream, longing for water to cleanse her instead of blood. "Why must it be me?" she whispered to the night, her voice fragile yet fierce. No answer came, only the gentle lapping of the river as if mocking her despair. Hours passed, though they felt like moments stolen from eternity. She drifted from one place to another, the village behind her, the wilderness ahead, caught in the grip of indecision. Her body trembled from hunger and fear, yet her mind refused to quiet. Each thought was a battle, between her instinct to obey and her need to preserve the last fragment of her dignity. If she gave in fully, would she still be herself? Or would she become nothing more than her stepmother's shadow, a puppet of cruelty? By the time the moon reached its highest point, her legs ached, and her heart felt raw from the endless turmoil. She sank onto a patch of grass, clutching the gourd close to her chest. Her tears fell silently, soaking into the earth beneath her. She knew she could not wander forever. Sooner or later she would have to face the command. Yet deep within her sorrow, A strange resolve began to flicker. There had to be another way, some hidden path between obedience and ruin. The night whispered around her, carrying hints of secrets she did not yet understand, as though waiting for her to discover them. The night pressed closer as she sat beneath the trees, the gourd pressed tightly to her chest, her tears staining the earth. The silence was so deep that every beat of her heart seemed to echo louder than the croak of frogs or the whisper of the river. But as she closed her eyes, exhausted from fear and wandering, that silence began to change. It was no longer empty, it was layered, alive, vibrating with something beyond her. At first she thought it was her imagination, the delirium of hunger and despair, but then the voices came, soft as a breeze yet undeniable, brushing against her ears like secrets meant only for her. They were not voices of the living. They carried weight, like echoes rolling through the corridors of time. She could not tell if they came from the earth beneath her or the air around her, but they filled her chest, calming the frantic pounding of her heart. "Child of suffering," they murmured, their tones weaving together like the threads of an unseen cloth, "you carry the pain of others but not their cruelty. Do not let this demand break you. The blood your stepmother seeks is not yours." Her eyes flew open, startled, her gaze darting around the dark grove. Shadows loomed but nothing moved. The fireflies flickered over the grass and the moonlight trembled across the river, yet the voices remained, steady and near, though no figure could be seen. Her breath came quick, sharp as she whispered into the emptiness, "Who speaks to me? What do you mean?" The voices deepened, growing clearer. "We are those who came before. The ancestors whose bones rest beneath these soils, whose spirits linger in the roots of the trees and the flow of the river. We have seen your suffering. We have heard the cries you thought no one cared to answer. You are not abandoned." Their words wrapped around her like a cloak, and though her skin shivered with fear, her spirit felt the faint warmth of recognition. Her stepmother's command weighed in her mind, sharp as a blade, to wash her face with blood. Until now she had believed it must mean her own, a cruel demand to scar herself in order to prove obedience. But the voices whispered otherwise. "The blood required will not come from your flesh. Do not wound yourself. The earth holds its own blood. Seek it and you will know." The girl clutched the gourd tighter, her trembling hands beginning to still. For the first time since the order had been given, she felt the faintest spark of hope flicker. The ancestors were offering her a path, one her stepmother had not considered, one hidden from cruelty's narrow mind. Yet doubt still gnawed at her. "If I return without human blood, she will know I have defied her," she whispered to the night. But the voices responded with firm clarity, "Let her see what she does not understand. Her cruelty has blinded her. What she asks for is power through fear. But true power does not come from harming the innocent. It comes from what lies beneath, unseen by eyes clouded with envy. Trust the path we show you, child. The blood that will cleanse your face flows, but it is not your own." As the voices faded into the hum of crickets and the rustle of the leaves, the girl remained frozen, her mind racing with their words. She thought of the red earth she had walked over many times, soil stained with the iron of generations. She thought of the sap of certain trees, rich and crimson in the moonlight. She thought of the river that sometimes ran red after heavy rains washed clay into its waters. Could these be the signs the ancestors hinted at? Was there more to the world than what her stepmother's cruelty imagined? Her body was still weak, her stomach hollow, but her spirit no longer sagged under despair. She rose slowly to her feet, her eyes scanning the dark, her ears alert to every whisper of the night. For the first time she did not feel entirely alone. The presence lingered with her, not gone but watchful, as though they walked with her unseen. Her hands steadied and her steps grew firmer. The gourd at her side no longer felt like a prison but like a vessel waiting for revelation. The ancestors' whispers followed her as she walked, their tones shifting between warning and encouragement. "Do not fear the test. Do not fear her. Her cruelty is her weakness, not yours. Where she seeks humiliation you will find transformation. Where she demands blood, you will discover truth." By the time she returned to the edge of the river, the night felt different. The darkness no longer suffocated, it breathed with her, alive, full of unseen guidance. The girl knelt, touching the soil where the river met the bank. Her fingers came away stained with damp, reddish clay, the color deep and unmistakable in the pale moonlight. She gasped softly, her heart pounding, not with terror this time but with awe. Could this be what the ancestors meant? Could this earth be the blood that did not come from her? She lifted her stained fingers to her face, her reflection shimmering in the ripples of the river. The clay streaked her skin like war paint, glowing faintly under the moon's gaze. For the first time, she did not feel like prey under her stepmother's command. She felt chosen, guided, and armed with a secret larger than cruelty itself. The whispers faded into silence once more, leaving her with the echo of their promise. The blood required will not come from your own body. And with that knowledge burning within her, she knew her fate was no longer bound by fear alone. The night had grown thick with silence, broken only by the hiss of insects and the distant croak of frogs. She remained kneeling by the riverbank, staring at her clay-stained fingers, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The words of the ancestors echoed within her. The blood required will not come from your own body. And though the meaning pressed against her mind like a riddle, something in her heart told her the answer was near. The air shifted suddenly. The leaves rustled, though no wind blew. The soil beneath her bare feet seemed to tremble faintly, as if something deep below stirred. She held the gourd close, her wide eyes darting to the shadows that stretched and swayed unnaturally along the ground. It was then that the first drop came, thick, warm and red, splattering onto the pale stones at her feet. She gasped and drew back, her heart thundering in her chest. Another drop followed, then another, trickling from the bark of the tree beside her. The girl staggered to her feet, stunned as the ancient tree groaned low, as though straining under the weight of centuries. From its trunk seeped a dark crimson sap, thick as blood, oozing in rivulets down its rough surface. The sight filled her with both awe and fear. She reached out a trembling hand, dipping her finger into the sap. It was sticky, heavy, and unmistakably red, the earth's own lifeblood. She whispered a prayer of thanks, her voice shaky yet reverent, knowing the ancestors had guided her to this revelation. But the miracle did not end there. All around her, the night began to hum with strange energy. The ground seemed to pulse faintly beneath her toes, and when she looked down, she saw small fissures opening in the soil. From them seeped a liquid as red as the sap, flowing across the roots and into the grass. The earth was bleeding, its veins releasing what her stepmother demanded, but without a wound inflicted upon her. A rustle drew her gaze to the thicket nearby. A hare darted out, its fur glowing strangely under the moonlight. It stumbled, and as it leapt past her, a single drop of red fell from its paw and landed on the rim of the gourd. Yet the animal did not falter from pain. It continued onward, unharmed, as if it had merely carried the offering to her before vanishing into the trees. She stood rooted in place, her breath catching in her throat. It was as though the entire night had bent itself to her need, each part of nature answering the injustice she bore. The tree's sap, the earth's flow, the blood-like drops from the passing creature. Together, they wove a message she could no longer deny. The world itself had chosen to respond, to protect her from the cruelty of her stepmother's command. Kneeling again, she positioned the gourd beneath the flow of the crimson sap. The vessel drank deeply, the sound soft and steady as the liquid filled it. Her hand steadied as she held it firm, her face bathed in the eerie glow of the moon reflecting off the gourd's surface. She felt the whispers of the ancestors stirring again, though now they were wordless, only a presence, a chorus of approval that filled her with strength. When the gourd was half full, the flow began to slow. The tree groaned once more, its surface sealing, its offering complete. The fissures in the earth closed silently, and the hum of the night faded back into stillness. All at once, it was as though nothing had happened, yet the gourd in her hands proved otherwise, warm and heavy with the lifeblood gifted to her. She cradled it close, her body trembling not from fear this time, but from awe and a strange kind of power she had never known. She understood then that she was not merely surviving her stepmother's cruelty, she was part of something larger, something older than cruelty itself. The ancestors, the trees, the animals, the earth, they had all chosen to answer her suffering. And as she gazed at the gourd, now brimming with the world's mysterious blood, a calm spread across her face. For the first time since the command had been spoken, she felt ready to return, not as a broken child obeying, but as one who carried the strength of the earth itself in her hands. The village gathered in the courtyard as dawn stretched its pale fingers across the horizon. Women bent low over their morning fires, children chased each other through the dust, and men sharpened tools for the day's work. But when they saw the girl approaching with the clay gourd pressed to her chest, silence spread like a wave, rippling outward until the entire place stilled. Her stepmother, standing tall among the crowd with her arms crossed, narrowed her eyes, lips curling in anticipation of humiliation. She expected the girl to stumble back empty-handed, weeping with shame or worse, bloodied from some desperate act of obedience. Instead, the girl moved forward with steady steps, her gaze lowered but her back straight, carrying the vessel as though it were sacred. The stepmother's voice sliced through the hush. So you return. Did you dare obey? Or will you stand here defiant and face punishment? Her words dripped with cruelty, but beneath them trembled a note of curiosity. She had been so certain her command was impossible, and yet here the girl stood, not broken, not weeping, but strangely composed. The girl did not reply with words. Instead, she knelt upon the packed earth, placing the gourd before her. The crowd leaned closer, whispers rustling like dry grass. She dipped her hands into the vessel, and when she raised them, all saw the crimson liquid shimmer in the light. It was unmistakably blood, yet it glowed faintly as though alive with a fire beneath its surface. Gasps broke from the villagers. Slowly, with hands trembling only slightly, she lifted the blood to her face. The stepmother smirked, eager for the girl's dignity to be drowned in shame. But the moment the liquid touched her skin, the air shifted. The glow spread across her cheeks, her forehead, her chin, until her entire face shone with a radiant red light. It was not grotesque or shameful. It was beautiful, almost divine. The villagers shielded their eyes, murmuring in awe. Her skin gleamed as if the ancestors themselves had painted her with their blessing. The stepmother's smirk faltered. She stepped forward, her voice rising sharply. No. This cannot be. But already her scheme was unraveling. The blood that was meant to humiliate had become a crown, and the command that was meant to break had instead exalted. The glow pulsed, spilling outward like a tide. Those standing nearest felt its warmth upon their faces, and with it came an unsettling weight, a reminder of every cruel word they had spoken or ignored. The villagers began to bow their heads, some covering their eyes, others whispering prayers. The girl lowered her hands, her face now radiant, glowing like a mask of fire and spirit. She turned to look at her stepmother, and though her lips did not move, the power in her gaze was enough to silence even the most defiant. The stepmother staggered back, her confidence slipping into panic. The villagers' murmurs grew louder, voices trembling with both fear and awe. It is the ancestors, one woman whispered. They have chosen her. Another added, she is no longer the child of cruelty, she is the child of justice. The stepmother's rage twisted her face. She cried out, it is a trick. She has deceived you all. But even as she spoke, her own body betrayed her. The glow reflected in her eyes, and the weight of its power pressed against her chest. She clutched at her heart, gasping as if the blood's radiance burned her from within. Her cruelty, once a weapon she wielded so freely, now curled back upon her like a serpent biting its master. The villagers stepped away from her, leaving her exposed in her weakness, no longer convinced of her authority. The girl rose slowly to her feet. She did not gloat, nor did she speak. Her silence was sharper than any accusation. Each step she took toward her stepmother seemed to deepen the glow, its light crawling across the ground, up the walls of huts, into the very air. It was as though the ancestors had come alive in her presence, judging not with words but with undeniable power. The stepmother fell to her knees. She tried to avert her gaze, but the girl's glowing face drew her eyes like a force she could not resist. Trembling, she raised her hands in a feeble gesture of defense. Enough, she whispered, her voice breaking. Stop this. But there was no stopping it. The glow was not hers to command, nor was it the girl's alone. It was the world's answer to cruelty. One by one the villagers dropped to their knees as well. Not out of fear for the girl, but out of reverence for the power that surrounded her. They recognized the truth written in her radiance, that what had been meant as her downfall had been transformed into her ascension. The ritual of cruelty had become a ritual of justice, turned back against the hand that devised it. At last the glow began to soften, though it did not disappear. A faint shimmer remained upon her skin, a mark that could not be washed away. The girl stood in silence, her eyes sweeping across the bowed heads of her neighbors, lingering for a long moment on her stepmother, who still cowered in the dust. For the first time, it was not she who bore the weight of shame, it was the one who had tried to break her. The crowd did not cheer or celebrate. They simply watched in solemn awe, understanding they had witnessed a turning of balance, the punishment of cruelty by its own hand. The girl walked away, carrying no bitterness, only the quiet strength of one who had been lifted by forces beyond human malice. And from that day forward, none could look at her without remembering the blood that glowed, the ritual that backfired, and the truth that cruelty always summons its own undoing. The stepmother had waited eagerly for the moment of the girl's downfall. She had imagined it vividly, the child returning with her face streaked in shame, eyes lowered, body trembling, the villagers pointing and laughing as she stood disgraced. She thought she would bask in triumph, finally proving to everyone that the girl was nothing more than a weak and worthless burden. Her cruel heart had fed on this expectation for days, sharpening her tongue in preparation for the scorn she would heap upon the girl. But when the girl stepped back into the compound, her face washed not in shame but in a strange, luminous power, the stepmother's victory collapsed before her eyes. At first, she tried to laugh, forcing her voice to rise above the shocked murmurs of the villagers. "Look at her," she sneered. "She has smeared herself with filth and thinks it makes her special." Yet even as she spoke, her laughter rang hollow, trembling with unease. For every villager could see what she could not deny, the glow of strength across the girl's face, the way her presence silenced mockery and stilled the restless air. The villagers who once listened to the stepmother's venom without question, now turned their eyes on her instead. They remembered her cruelty, her endless demands, and how she had singled out the girl with punishments no child should endure. Whispers spread like dry leaves in the wind. "It was her command," someone muttered. "She sent the child to do this." Another voice followed, "The ancestors have shamed her." The stepmother's cheeks flushed hot as the murmurs grew louder. No longer was she the figure of authority, no longer the voice that set the rules, she was being judged by the very people she had once manipulated. Fear clawed at her chest. She tried to defend herself, to twist her story as she always had. "I only wanted to teach her obedience," she stammered, her voice cracking. "I meant no harm. It was a lesson, nothing more." But the villagers' eyes no longer carried sympathy for her words. Where once they saw authority, now they saw malice uncovered. Her excuses fell flat, and her power slipped from her hands like water from a broken pot. The girl, standing silently nearby, became her undoing without uttering a single word. Every time the stepmother tried to insult her, the faint glow of the girl's face shone brighter in the villagers' eyes, making the stepmother look smaller, weaker, pettier. It was as though the ancestors themselves had shifted the balance of judgment, placing all the weight of cruelty on the woman who had issued the command. That night, when the village fires burned and stories were retold, the stepmother became the subject of ridicule. Men shook their heads at her foolishness, women whispered about her jealousy, and children giggled behind her back. The very laughter she had once directed at the girl now followed her wherever she walked. For a woman who had built her identity on power and control, humiliation was sharper than any blade. Even her own household turned against her. Her husband, weary of her endless cruelty, no longer defended her. Her children, who once echoed her taunts, grew uneasy and avoided her eyes. The stepmother, who had expected to stand tall on the girl's broken spirit, instead found herself isolated, cut down by the weight of her own scheme. And so, the command she had meant to destroy the girl became the stone that crushed her pride. What was intended as a punishment revealed instead her malice, and the ancestors themselves seemed to strip her of the authority she had wielded so mercilessly. She had wanted triumph, but what she received was humiliation, the slow, relentless fall of a woman undone by the cruelty she had thought was power. The morning after the ritual, the village did not wake with its usual rhythm of pounding mortars, the lowing of cattle, or the laughter of children at play. Instead, silence spread across the compound like a sickness. Every pair of eyes seemed fixed on the girl, who now carried herself differently. She no longer walked with the downcast shoulders of a child accustomed to humiliation. Her steps were deliberate, her back straight, her face still marked with that faint, unearthly glow. Even when she sat by the fire to tend to her chores, the shimmer caught in the flames, making her appear less like a servant and more like a being pulled from another realm. Whispers began. Women drawing water at the river bent their heads together, their voices trembling. "It is not natural," one murmured. "The blood should have shamed her, but it crowned her instead." Another shook her head. "It is the ancestors. They have risen in her." Children, usually so bold in their teasing, now kept their distance. When they saw her passing, they ducked behind trees or huts, peeking out wide-eyed, as though afraid her glowing gaze might fall upon them. The men, proud and unyielding, found themselves uneasy in her presence. Their hands fumbled on tools, their words faltered mid-sentence when she drew near. Her stepmother, once the loudest voice in the household, kept herself hidden. The woman's authority, once unquestioned, had been shattered in a single night. She muttered curses in secret, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, but even she dared not confront the girl directly. For every time she tried, her words stuck in her throat, and her chest tightened as if unseen fingers gripped her heart. It was as though the blood's glow clung to her cruelty, reflecting her malice back at her like a mirror she could not escape. The villagers gathered in small groups, seeking explanation. Some claimed the girl had been chosen, that she was now a vessel for powers older than the village itself. Others whispered darker things, that she had consorted with forbidden spirits, that her glow was not blessing but curse. Fear took root deeper than awe, for what people could not understand they soon learned to dread. The drummers refused to beat their instruments in her presence, afraid their rhythms might summon something they could not control. The elders, who once dismissed her as nothing more than a burden, now sat in uneasy circles debating what to do. To confront her might mean provoking forces beyond their grasp. To ignore her might mean leaving the village at the mercy of whatever had awakened. At night the fear sharpened. Those who lived near her hut claimed to hear whispers in the darkness, soft voices that did not belong to any living person. They said the ancestors walked the village paths, their footsteps heavy with warning. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the firelight, bending toward her hut as though drawn by its unseen power. Even the animals grew restless. Goats bleated without reason, dogs barked and then whimpered, and the chickens scattered as if chased by invisible hands. The girl herself spoke little, but her silence carried more weight than words. When she lifted her head to meet someone's gaze, that faint shimmer across her face seemed to pierce deeper than flesh, as if she could see straight into the hidden places of the heart. The villagers began to avoid her eyes, bowing their heads whenever she walked past. To them she was no longer just a girl. She was an omen. A reminder that cruelty, once unleashed, always returns transformed. Children were told to behave or risk the glowing one watching them. Women told stories in hushed tones around the fire, reshaping the events of that night into a tale that grew with each retelling. Some claimed she had not merely washed her face with blood, but that the earth itself had bled for her. Others said they saw flames in her eyes, or that her shadow walked separate from her body. Each version spread faster than the last, feeding the fear until it blanketed the village like an unshakable fog. The elders finally called for a gathering beneath the great baobab tree. The entire village assembled, their faces taut with unease. The girl was brought forward, not dragged but walking of her own accord, calm and unflinching. When she stood before them, the murmurs ceased. Even the birds seemed to still in the branches. One elder cleared his throat, but when he opened his mouth to speak, his words faltered. He stared at her glowing face and his voice trembled. "What are you?" he asked, the question falling into the silence like a stone into deep water. The girl did not answer, not with words. She only looked at him, and in that gaze lay something vast and immeasurable, something both human and not. The elder bowed his head, unable to hold her eyes. The others followed, dropping their gazes, their fear sealing their lips. None dared accuse her, none dared demand, none dared punish. That night, the village remained restless. Fires burned longer than usual, conversations whispered into the shadows. Some wanted to drive her away, to banish her before the power within her consumed them all. Others argued that to cast her out would invite even greater wrath, that the ancestors themselves had marked her as untouchable. But in every voice, whether for or against her, there was the same trembling fear. The girl sat quietly in her hut, the faint glow of her face casting soft light upon the mud walls. She did not smile, nor did she weep. She simply existed in her new form, both burdened and exalted, while outside the entire village held its breath, knowing that life would never again return to what it had been before the blood turned against cruelty and awakened something beyond their control. When the villagers gathered the next morning, their voices low and uncertain, it was not the girl they looked upon with suspicion or judgment, but themselves. For in the glow of her face, washed not with shame but with strength, they saw a reflection of their own silence, their own complicity. They remembered every time they had turned away when the stepmother struck her with cruel commands, every time they had laughed instead of questioned, every time they had chosen convenience over compassion. The girl's endurance, quiet and unbroken, stood against the backdrop of their harshness, exposing it like sunlight on a hidden wound. The elders, who had prided themselves on wisdom, were the first to speak. One of the oldest men cleared his throat, but his voice trembled as he admitted what none had dared to say aloud. "We allowed cruelty to rule where kindness should have lived. We gave power to bitterness instead of truth." His words carried the weight of shame, and the people bowed their heads. For it was true, cruelty had been woven into their way of living, disguised as discipline, hidden beneath the veil of tradition. Yet now, staring at the girl who had endured what no child should, they saw how empty those excuses had been. The stepmother, humiliated and shrinking under the gaze of the village, tried to shift the blame once more, but no one listened. The people's eyes were fixed on the girl. Her body still looked frail, her shoulders thin from deprivation, but her presence was undeniable, radiant in a way no one could explain. The villagers realized that the punishment meant to stain her with disgrace had instead stained them with guilt. They had allowed the suffering of innocence, and now it marked them far deeper than blood ever could. Women murmured among themselves, remembering their own daughters, imagining them forced into such cruelty. Men shuffled uneasily, ashamed of the laughter they had once shared at the girl's expense. Even the children, who had once copied the mocking words of adults, stood in silence, sensing the weight of what had been revealed. In the quiet that followed, the truth became clear to all. Blood on the skin can be washed away, but cruelty in the heart leaves a scar that lingers long after. The elders decreed that the girl would no longer be treated as an outcast or a scapegoat. She had endured what none of them could have borne, and in her endurance she had shown them the true face of their community. They promised change, though each knew that promises alone could not erase the shame of what they had allowed. The lesson would have to live on, carried not only in words but in actions, in how they chose to treat the weak, the voiceless, and the innocent from that day forward. For the girl there was no need to boast or condemn. Her silence spoke louder than any accusation. She had endured the cruelty, and she had emerged not broken, but illuminated by something greater than their understanding. And as the villagers looked upon her, they felt a truth settle deep within their hearts. It was not the washing of her face with blood that transformed her, but the purity of her spirit that could not be stained. In her endurance they found their shame, and in her resilience, they found the lesson they could never forget, that cruelty stains the heart far more than blood ever could stain the body. Under the glow of countless moons and the whispers of countless seasons, her story did not fade into silence. Instead it grew as stories often do, shaped by voices, molded by fear, awe, and reverence. The tale of the girl who had been ordered to wash her face with blood but bore none of her own became more than an account of cruelty. It became a legend that spoke across generations. Children grew up hearing of her, elders recited her name in hushed tones, and travelers carried the story beyond the village boundaries until it touched places that had never known her suffering but understood her endurance. She was no longer merely a victim of injustice. She became the symbol of how the spirit, once awakened by truth and ancestral justice, could never be buried again. The villagers who had once looked upon her with suspicion now spoke of her in awe. They recalled the night when the earth itself had answered, when blood flowed not from her veins but from the living world around them, as though nature itself had rebelled against cruelty. That image, the glowing blood upon her face, turning her shame into power, remained etched in memory like fire upon stone. Elders told the young that it was not her suffering that defined her, but her refusal to be broken, her willingness to obey even the most merciless command without yielding her own life. This endurance, this patience, this quiet strength transformed her into a figure greater than her own existence. Songs rose in her name, haunting chants carried across fields during harvest time. Dancers moved in circles at night, their bodies twisting like branches in the wind, retelling how innocence had called forth the voices of ancestors. Some claimed they still heard those whispers in the dead of night, when the wind curled between huts or when the drums fell silent at festivals. Others swore they saw her shadow, luminous and calm, moving among them during times of great injustice, as though she had never truly left but lingered as guardian and reminder. The stepmother's fall became as important a part of the legend as the girl's endurance. Children learned not to despise others, not to taunt weakness, for the tale showed how cruelty returns to consume the cruel. Women whispered it to daughters, warning them of envy and bitterness that corrode the heart. Men repeated it to sons, teaching that strength is not measured by how one crushes others but by how one carries pain without surrender. The story seeped into daily life, woven into morals, stitched into rituals, carved into the bones of memory. In distant villages where the girl's name was unknown, she was still recognized as the blood-washed one, a symbol that cruelty could not erase the essence of a soul. She became more than flesh, more than her own suffering. She was transformed into a lesson that lived beyond her time. Firesides glowed as griots spoke of her with words heavy like the earth and sharp like spears. They declared that when a child is wronged, the ancestors rise. When innocence is stained, the very soil remembers. And so, her legend lived not only in her village but in the echoing heart of the land itself. The girl herself, now older, walked among those who once feared her glow. They no longer saw her as cursed but as touched, chosen, marked by something greater. Though she bore scars of memory, she carried them not as chains but as signs of survival. Her silence at times was heavier than words, for when she sat by the fire, others hushed, waiting for even the smallest gesture. She had become living myth, her breath intertwined with the breath of the ancestors who had once guided her. Generations passed, yet the legend did not dim. When injustice threatened, when cruelty whispered, when children cried out in secret despair, her story returned like dawn breaking through long nights. Mothers hushed their babies with it, reminding them that no wound inflicted by others could forever define the soul. Elders closed disputes with it, urging forgiveness, patience, and the knowledge that truth always finds its way to light. And when strangers visited, they too carried the tale back to their own people, ensuring it would never vanish. The legacy of the blood-washed face was not of sorrow but of transformation. It told of a girl who was meant to be broken but instead became unbreakable. It told of a village meant to witness shame but instead confronted its own guilt. It told of ancestors whose whispers did not die with the winds but lived within the veins of every listener who carried the story forward. And so, across time she remained, her image glowing, her face no longer stained by cruelty but illuminated by justice. A tale of blood without violence, of innocence stronger than cruelty, of a spirit guarded by the eternal. She became legend, she remained memory, she endured as justice wrapped in story. And every time the tale was told, the ancestors stirred once again, whispering through the night, that cruelty is never stronger than endurance, that injustice never outlives truth, and that even when a face is washed with blood, it can shine brighter than the sun.